Have you ever prayed and felt like your words were hitting a ceiling, like you were speaking, but nothing was answering back? Or have you ever gone through the motions of faith so many times that prayer started to feel less like a real conversation and more like something you were simply supposed to do? If you have ever felt that, you are not outside the Bible. You are inside it. Because some of the most honest prayers in Scripture were spoken by people who were confused, disappointed, corrected, or trying to change before it was too late. That is why Psalm 22, Psalm 50, and Psalm 101 matter so much. One is about a man who prayed and felt completely abandoned by God. One is about people who were doing everything right religiously, only for God to reveal that something essential was missing. And one is written by a man who knew from his own life how badly a person can fall and still chose to write down the boundaries he needed in order to stay close to God. These are not comfortable psalms, but they may be some of the most honest prayers in the Bible. Most people think of the Psalms as beautiful poetry or comforting words for difficult days, and many of them are exactly that. But the Psalms are also much more direct than people expect. They do not hide human pain, spiritual failure, guilt, confusion, or the struggle to live differently. They bring all of it into the presence of God. Psalm 22 shows a person suffering and still speaking to God. Psalm 50 shows people performing religion while missing the heart of worship. And Psalm 101 shows a man making decisions about the kind of life he refuses to lose. So let's read them honestly, not as distant religious poetry, but as three very human moments before God. The first one is Psalm 22, and it begins with one of the most painful sentences in Scripture. My God, why have you forsaken me? Most people recognize those words because Jesus says them on the cross. But before they were spoken from the cross, they were written in the Psalms. That matters because Jesus was not quoting a random line of despair. He was entering into one of the deepest prayers of suffering ever written. Psalm 22 is not the prayer of someone having a small, difficult day. David describes himself as surrounded, mocked, humiliated, and physically weakened. People look at his suffering and say, "He trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him." That is a brutal kind of pain because it is not only private suffering, it is public humiliation. People are not just seeing his pain, they are using it against him. And yet, the first words are still, "My God." That is the detail many people miss. David feels abandoned, but he does not stop speaking to God. He does not say, "There is no God." He does not say, "I am done with God." He brings the wound directly into prayer. That is what makes Psalm 22 so honest. It shows that real faith is not always calm, polished, or confident. Sometimes real faith sounds like a person saying, "God, I do not understand where you are, but I am still talking to you." This matters because many people were taught, directly or indirectly, that prayer has to sound controlled, respectful, and spiritually strong. But the Bible includes prayers that sound desperate, confused, exhausted, and still faithful. David does not clean up his emotions before he prays. He starts with the truth, and the truth is painful. Why have you forsaken me? But Psalm 22 does not stay there. As the psalm continues, David begins to remember. He remembers that God was faithful to those before him. He remembers that others cried out and were delivered. And by verse 24, the tone has changed. He says that God has not despised the suffering of the afflicted one, and has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. That is the movement of the psalm. It begins with, "Why have you forsaken me?" and it moves toward, "You were listening to me." The circumstances do not seem to change instantly. There is no easy explanation dropped from heaven. What changes first is David's perception. At the beginning, pain makes him feel abandoned. By the end, he sees that his suffering did not mean God had stopped listening. That is why Psalm 22 still matters. It does not give a cheap explanation for suffering. It gives suffering a voice. It teaches that pain can be brought to God without being disguised as strength. And it reminds us that feeling abandoned is not always the same as being abandoned. For anyone who has ever prayed in the dark, Psalm 22 says something deeply important. Do not turn your pain into silence. Turn it into prayer. Even if the first sentence is broken, even if the first words are full of confusion, speak to God from where you actually are. But then Psalm 50 hits differently, because here, the painful voice is not coming from a suffering man. It is coming from God himself. In the common English numbering, Psalm 50 is connected with Asaph, and the scene is serious. God summons his people and confronts them. But he is not speaking to people who have completely abandoned religion. He is speaking to people who are still bringing sacrifices, still performing rituals, and still showing up. From the outside, they look religious. But God sees the deeper problem. The actions are still there, but the heart has become disconnected. God says in effect, I am not rebuking you because you failed to bring sacrifices. Your offerings are continually before me. But do you really think this is what I need from you? Then he asks if he eats the flesh of bulls or drinks the blood of goats. The image is sharp on purpose. God is exposing a false idea of worship. The people had started treating worship like a transaction. Bring the offering, perform the duty, say the right words, and expect blessing in return. But God makes it clear that he is not hungry, dependent, or impressed by empty performance. Every animal of the forest already belongs to him. The cattle on 1,000 hills are his. The world and everything in it is already his. So, if God owns everything, what does he actually want? Psalm 50 gives the answer. Call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you will honor me. That line is the heart of the psalm. God is not asking for performance without relationship. He is calling them back to honest dependence. He is saying, do not stand before me with religious actions while hiding your real heart. Bring me your trouble. Bring me your fear. Bring me your need. This is why Psalm 50 still hits hard. It is possible to look spiritual and still be distant from God. A person can pray with the mouth while the heart is somewhere else. A person can read scripture but not listen. A person can keep religious habits and slowly become cold, proud, distracted, or transactional. Psalm 50 interrupts that illusion. It asks a hard question. Are you worshiping God, or are you trying to manage God? Are you bringing your heart, or just your routine? And this is not only judgment, it is mercy. God could have stayed silent and let the people continue with empty religion, but instead, he speaks. He corrects them, because he is calling them back to what is real. That is why this psalm is a reset. It strips worship down to something honest. A person in trouble calling on God, and God answering not because he was manipulated by ritual, but because he is truly God. This is a necessary word for anyone who has ever felt their spiritual life become mechanical. When prayer becomes only words, when scripture becomes only information, when worship becomes only habit, Psalm 50 brings a person back to the center. God does not need religious performance. He wants the real heart. And then Psalm 101 brings the whole conversation closer to daily life. Because this one is not about surviving pain, and it is not about being corrected. It is about deciding what kind of person you are becoming. David is describing the kind of life he wants to live before God. He says, I will be careful to lead a blameless life. Then he becomes very practical. He talks about what he will allow before his eyes, what kind of people he will not attach himself to, and what kind of behavior he refuses to tolerate. This is not vague spirituality. David is not simply saying, I want to be good. He is naming the places where a person is shaped: attention, relationships, home, habits, and private choices. That is what makes Psalm 101 so relevant. It understands that the soul is shaped slowly. Most people do not fall all at once. They drift. They compromise little by little. They get used to things they once would have rejected. They allow certain voices, desires, and influences to stay close long enough that those things begin to feel normal. And once something feels normal, it becomes easier to justify. That is why David says, I will not look with approval on anything that is vile. He is not only talking about avoiding obvious evil, he is talking about approval, attention, and admiration. Because what a person admires, they slowly move toward. What a person keeps looking at with approval eventually begins to shape them. And today David's words feel strangely current. What he called, what I set before my eyes, we now meet through screens, feeds, images, voices, and opinions. Psalm 101 asks an ancient question in modern form. What are you letting shape your attention long enough to shape your soul? When we read David's wider story, we know the Bible does not hide his failures. He sinned deeply, abused power, harmed others, and knew what it meant to fall. So when David writes about guarding his eyes, his home, and his integrity, these are not the words of a man who thinks he is above temptation. They sound like the words of someone who knows how dangerous temptation really is. That makes Psalm 101 more human, not less. It is the decision of a person who understands that a life close to God does not happen by accident. Psalm 101 teaches something the other two Psalms do not. Psalm 22 teaches us how to speak to God when we are already in pain. Psalm 50 teaches us how to return to God when worship has become empty. But Psalm 101 teaches us to make decisions before the collapse, before the compromise, before the fall. It is the psalm of spiritual boundaries. Not boundaries as fear, but boundaries as protection for what is sacred. That question still matters. What are you allowing to shape you? Not what do you say you believe, and not what image do people see from the outside, but what is actually forming your heart in private. When you place Psalm 22, Psalm 50, and Psalm 101 side by side, they create a very honest map of the human life before God. Psalm 22 speaks to suffering. It asks whether you will still speak to God when he feels silent. Psalm 50 speaks to empty religion. It asks whether you are offering God your heart or only your habits. Psalm 101 speaks to responsibility. It asks what kind of life you are building before the crisis comes. Together, these psalms cover three things every person eventually faces: pain, correction, and choice. There will be moments when life hurts and you do not understand. There will be moments when you realize your spiritual life has become mechanical. And there will be moments when you have to decide what kind of person you are becoming. That is why these psalms are not just ancient religious texts. They are mirrors. They do not flatter us, entertain us, or let us hide behind spiritual language. They bring us back to what is real pain, real worship, and real choices. If you are in pain and God feels silent, read Psalm 22 slowly, and do not rush past the first verse. If your spiritual life has become mechanical, read Psalm 50, and let it ask whether your heart is actually present. And if you know that something in your life needs to change before it becomes destructive, read Psalm 101 as a decision, not because you are perfect, but because the life you build in private matters. Together, these three psalms show that prayer is not only about asking God for things. Prayer is where suffering becomes honest, where worship becomes real, and where the heart begins to choose a different way of living. And maybe the honest question is this: which of these three psalms describes where you are right now? Psalm 22, where pain is still trying to speak to God. Psalm 50, where religion needs to become real again. Or Psalm 101, where it is time to make a decision before something shapes you too deeply. If you feel comfortable, write it in the comments, not as a performance, but as an honest answer, because that is what the Psalms have always been, a human voice standing before God without pretending. And maybe that is why they still speak so deeply. Beneath all the language, all the history, and all the theology, they tell the truth about us, and they tell the truth about God. A God who hears pain, a God who refuses empty performance, and a God who still calls human beings into a life that can be made clean again.